Thank you everybody for spending part of your Sunday with us. My name is Jessie Peters. I use she, her, hers. I'm a member of 40th United, which is the local IPO here in the ward that works to get progressive people elected and make sure that the narrative is out. And we host these conversations every couple weeks. And so today we are doing one on like trans rights. Trans rights are human rights. And so we have a very robust panel today. So I'm gonna get started with just kind of like an opening to make sure that everyone's grounded on like what the hell the status quo is. So like we are at the 51-year mark of Stonewall, right? Which is this like the brains, blood, and passion that was led by Black trans women. And typically today, it's the Pride Parade. And speaking on behalf of myself, like I would much rather be with you all than surrounded by corporations that are just like straight washing this movement and just showing up one day to kind of walk with their balloons. Because I, like, for my day job, I work in local government. I work for a local alderman here. And one thing that I find super fascinating is that, like, Illinois may vote blue, but a couple years ago, Elise and I were working at Equality Illinois, and we had heard how, like, there are trans youth that live down in Carbondale that have to take an Amtrak train for 6 hours to get health care up here. And it's mind blowing to me because we pat ourselves on the back. And so I really want today to kind of be focused on how can we push the narrative and like, how can we make sure that it is not just a slogan. It is not just something that we stand for. And the thing that like motivated me to want to work with 40th United to do this topic was the murder of Selena Reyes Hernandez. Sorry, I'm terrible with last names. But she was murdered a few weeks ago, and it is just like, it's cold-blooded. And I understand that like the shooter showed up at the police station the day after and kind of admitted it, but I am petrified that in 2020, like there's gonna be some fucking bogus defense that is out there and there's not gonna be this true accountability. And it's disheartening to me that, right, folks can't live their truth and like go on dates and invite people back and just be their authentic self. So I really want to like for us to be grounded in that. Like folks will probably talk about like the criminal justice system, right? But I just want to make sure that we kind of walk away with this duty to fight against hate at all levels, right? A few years ago, the LGBTQ movement and some folks were trying to remove the T. And it's really important to me personally that we keep the T and we allow the space to kind of talk and fight for that. So that's kind of why we're here and what the purpose is. Like I said, we have a really robust panel. So I'm gonna introduce folks, but then the first question that I would like for you to answer is, right, like you're taking time out of your Sunday. So what is it that you want to be true about the world and like about the folks that are participating at the end of this talk? So we're gonna start with Aisha Davis. She is a lawyer, activist, and unapologetically authentic human being. She is the vice chair for Affinity Community Service. That is the only organization in the country that focuses on the Black lesbian and those masculine of center. They've been serving the South Side of Chicago for 25 years. And for work, Aisha is a policy director for the AIDS Foundation of Chicago. So Aisha.
Hey everybody, as Jessie said, my name is Aisha. I use she, her pronouns. I am both the vice president of the board of directors at Affinity Community Services and also the director of policy at AFC. And thinking about wearing those two hats, I'd say that the thing that I want folks to take away from this conversation is an understanding that when we have conversations like this, the basic tenets of human rights apply to these conversations. But we also need to think about this conversation from the viewpoint of ensuring that the rights of the most marginalized people in our community are not only defended, but guaranteed, and aren't given solely because we have been forced to do so and bleed for it and fight for it. But really think about the fact that these are things that a lot of folks just take for granted as birthright. So I think that would be what I'd hope we walk away from with that understanding. And given that understanding, it's clear that we need to be centering the voices of Black trans women. So I'll leave it there.
Awesome, thank you for that. Next, we have Elise Malary. Elise is a community organizer, 40th Ward neighbor, and the best former coworker a girl could ask for. She is the lead organizer for the Chicago Therapy Collective Hire Trans Now project, which is an initiative that aims to transform the stark employment landscape for trans individuals by reducing the stigma to hire trans, preparing businesses to hire trans, and the cultivating of spirit for a citywide initiative. Please, what would you like to be true at the end of this talk?
Thank you so much, Jessie. And I just want people, what I want people to take away from this is just an understanding that this capitalist society and system that we all have to survive in was never designed for Black people. And it's even worse for Black trans people, especially Black trans women. So with that information, what us Black trans people need now, well, let's start with what we don't need. But the last thing that we don't need is performative allyship, okay? We don't need performative allyship right now because we're dying and our blood is being spilled on the streets. So that's the last thing we need is performative allyship. And if you want to scream Black trans lives matter, then prove it. Prove it through your actions and don't just scream it, be about it. So I want people to understand that. And yes, that's what I want, just people to take away from today, and just to know that Black trans people, especially Black trans women, deserve to be loved. We deserve to be mentored. We deserve to be supported. We deserve to be protected. And we need you to do that right now. So do it.
Awesome. Thank you. Next, we have Bryan Matias. Bryan is a former, or soon-to-be former, 40th Ward neighbor. He works as an engineer in corporate America, and in the evening, he's pursuing his dream of attending seminary by perfecting his home brew beer. Along with his best friend Shannon, he's the host of Sunday School Heathens podcast.
Hello, everybody. Dragging me for the corporate America thing. I'm trying to get out. But I would like everyone to know at the end of this conversation that trans rights are not a discrete set of rights that are separate from the other inequalities in this country. It's a lot of interconnected issues. There was just that Supreme Court case about LGBT rights for workers, but that doesn't mean anything if workers don't have rights in other ways. Like there's a lot of I'm blanking on the term, I'm sorry, at-will employment. So if we're not fighting for these other values, the fights that we are working on for trans people aren't going to get us anywhere. We need to look at the whole picture, and we need to also center, as other panelists have said, the voices of Black trans women, because trans people are not a monolith. I recognize that within the community, I have a higher level of privilege than a lot of other people.
Thank you for that. Next, we have Kim Fountain. Kim is the Chief Operating Officer at the Center on Halsted. In school, her emphasis was studying on issues of identity-based violence, She did field work studying the Presbyterian Church in order to better understand the intersection of politics of queerness and religion. And Kim has successfully advocated for government agencies for LGBTQ full inclusion. And having done so myself, like, this is no small accomplishment. So Kim. I'm not able to hear you. Is anybody else?
Can you hear me now, right?
Yes.
Better. Okay, great. There's too many buttons everywhere. I'm not used to them. So thank you so much for having me, and this panel is phenomenal, so thank you for putting this together. A couple things I want to, in terms of the takeaway. One is that I love that we're talking about rights. That's awesome. But also want to know that rights in the context of legislation can't be where we stop, right? Like, it has to really, rights has to extend beyond that legislative sphere, because as we've seen, like, you can give rights legislatively and those can be taken away, right? We really have to push for this sort of, across society, not just within the legislative field. The other thing that I'd love to have people take away from this is when we do talk about rights and we do talk about making certain that there's equity across the board, and we all love to put out that phrase equity, and several of the folks who've gone already have talked about how, you don't have equity unless you have folks who are, some of the most vulnerable populations, like Black trans women, but also that it means that people who are not Black trans women better be really ready to give up some of our power. Because if we're not willing to give up some of that power and make that expectations of the people within our groups who are not Black trans women, then, like Elise says, I go home, don't even come to the table, because giving up that power is going to be super important, and it gets ugly. So we have to stand. I think it's important for me, at least, to stand between, not that Black trans women can't fight their own fights. God knows they can, but just also be a buffer, right, to make certain that I take those hits too, as we're making people see power. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that. Next up, we have Stephanie. Stephanie is a lesbian, genderqueer, trans woman, and anti-Zionist Jew. For work, Stephanie is the executive director for Brave Space Alliance, the first Black-led, trans-led LGBTQ center dedicated to creating and providing affirming, for us, by us resources for individuals on the South and West Side. And while wearing her activism hat, she's the brains behind the progressive voter guide, Girl, I Guess.
Hi. Wow, it really sucks going last. Everybody else took so many of my good points. I think the thing that I really want to start us off with is Black trans people and the rights of trans people in general aren't some sort of sexy movement fad. You have to pay attention. You have to keep caring. This is something that you have to care about every hour of every day, because members of the community have to care about it every hour of every day. This is people's lives, this is people's communities, and this is, most of us who have been in the community a while and have been doing organizing for trans people have been to a rally or a vigil for a murdered trans woman, usually a Black trans woman, where there were maybe 16, 20 people showing up. And it gets exhausting when the people in your community that you see most regularly at these vigils, every now and then the number starts dwindling. Fewer people start showing up, and you're not sure whether it's because they couldn't make it to that event or something happened to them. We need cis folks to pay attention. We need cis folks to care. And to touch on something that Kim said, we need folks to redistribute their resources and give up their power. 0% of state and city funding for trans people went to trans-led organizations in 2018 and 2019. That's unacceptable. There are organizations like Brave Space Alliance that could do a hell of a lot with that money. And communities like ours that practice mutual aid, that practice organizing for the common good, that could do more with those resources than the organizations that they're going to. if you want to care about trans people, if you want to care about Black trans lives, you have to systematically invest in that community because it has been systematically divested from.
Thank you. We have one more panelist on today. We have Ted, who is the Advocacy and Community Affairs Manager for the Night Ministry, a Chicago-based organization that works for providing housing, healthcare, and the human connection to members of our community. While they may be moving into a new location soon, this organization is focused on meeting folks where they are, traveling around the city, delivering food and healthcare via their one-of-a-kind bus.
Thanks so much. So I think the one thing I want to bring folks to bring from the conversation is, from a service provider's perspective, the disproportionality of youth homelessness among trans youth in our city and in our state, and also the understanding that there's things that are happening right now that folks could add their voices to help service providers across our city and our state and our country better serve young people who are experiencing homelessness, specifically trans young people.
Thank you. Cool. So throughout the discussion today, we have some prepared questions that folks submitted ahead of time. But if there are questions that folks have throughout the discussion, then please put it into the chat box. Heather is monitoring that, and we'll just chime in if there is something. But to kick us off, I want to start with something that kind of Stephanie and Elise were talking about. So while all trans people are vulnerable to violence, we continue to see that trans women of color are being murdered at alarming rates. Can you speak on what might be behind this epidemic and what we can possibly do about it? What is that showing up that we can do?
Oh God, Elise, you want to go first on that?
Absolutely, absolutely. Well, as I said earlier, I want to remind everyone that the capitalist system that we all have to survive in was not designed for Black people. And it absolutely was not designed for Black trans women. So knowing that Black trans people face so much hiring discrimination. So if you can't even get a job, how are you going to even be able to be empowered? How are you going to have a roof over your head? How are you going to have the basic necessities that cis white people take for granted? So it starts off with the system that is so oppressive and keeps Black trans women from flourishing. And from there, that is where cis LGBT people need to step in and redistribute their power and wealth. And like someone mentioned earlier, invest in us. Don't just show up to, I love T-Door, I love T-Dub, T-Door is, I've been hearing from a lot of Black trans women and just trans women in general that T-Door is so, it's traumatizing, right? To relive the murders of my sisters and brothers and just trans people in general and siblings. So, we have these memorial events like T-Dove and T-Door. We need cis people to invest in us. We need cis people to mentor us. We need cis people to hire us. And we need cis people to advocate for us in certain situations. Sometimes trans people aren't even in meetings about them, right? So we need to be at the table we need to be at the table when there are decisions being made about us, especially within policy and advocacy. We need to be at the table and our voices need to be heard. And we need these, $1 million LGBTQ organizations to redistribute their funds. We need you to give back to grassroots organizations like Chicago Therapy Collective, like Brave Space Alliance, that are actually trans-led and people of color centered. You know, a lot of these $1 million LGBTQ organizations do not hire Black trans women, period. So we need them to step up and actually reallocate those funds. We need cis white people to put their money where their mouth is. You want to make sure a Black trans woman gets home safely, order her a Lyft. You want trans women to thrive? You want trans women to stay alive? Well, hire her.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm going to jump off at least the first thing that you said, which is that system that you were talking about. You are absolutely right. You know, and I think it goes, you know, it's so important to name it. It's not just transphobia, it's trans antagonism. People aren't afraid of us, they hate us.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just trans antagonism, it's trans misogyny, trans misogynoir for Black trans women in particular. It's colonialism, the system that created white supremacy and transphobia alongside each other to justify its own existence in the name of the Christian church, the Catholic Church, to be specific. And, you know, to also jump off of your point about some of the larger LGBTQ organizations, it's really, really important to see not just who hires. I mean, they don't even hire white trans women. I couldn't get a job until I got a job at Brave Space Alliance. You know, and this is a community-wide hiring problem where trans women across the board cannot get employment no matter how qualified we are. And it's not just in employment, it's systematic, I'm not even going to say discrimination, I'm going to say devaluing across the board in all sorts of different services. You know, we talk so much about the struggles of Black and brown trans youth, but we never talk about what happens to those Black and brown trans youth once they're not youth anymore. You know, people don't stop existing in marginalized systems or marginalizing systems when they turn 25, but according to all these youth programs, they do. You know, maybe they'll be lucky and they'll be able to last until those systems until they're 27 or 29, but folks' lives go on and their resources dry up. And so many of these programs that are designed to service Black and brown trans people, they're not really designed to service Black and brown trans people. They're designed to service white gay men. And their services were shifted towards servicing Black and brown trans women because, you know, that's a sexy population to serve. You'll get more grant money if you can bring in more trans bodies. You can feed people PrEP more easily if you serve a high at-risk population. But what do those services actually provide? Are any of these youth programs preparing youth for life after the system, or are they making them dependent on the system and not giving the youth opportunities to uplift themselves? Are these job training programs only training people to work at the organization running the program? Or are they providing useful skills? You know, maybe you don't want to work at Broadway Youth Center. Maybe you don't want to work at Howard Brown Health. Maybe you want to be in marketing. Maybe you want to be an accountant. Maybe you want to be a lawyer. Where are the job training programs for trans people to do those things? Not everybody is an outreach specialist. Not everybody wants to make a coin on their identity. Where are the housing programs that teach people to empower themselves to find housing or create housing-based solutions instead of just acting as somebody's landlord? You know, taking the landlord role away from actual landlords and putting it into a nonprofit sphere doesn't make it any less toxic of a relationship. And this is why, you know, at Brave Space Alliance, all of our programs are modeled on mutual aid. We have a housing insecurity group. Our housing insecurity group teaches people to find and create their own community sourced housing solutions, so nobody ever has to go to the door of a nonprofit and beg for a home again. Housing is a human right. And we have a food insecurity group. It teaches people to grow and cook their own food so that nobody has to go to a food bank. But we have a food pantry too, just in case they can't afford the seeds or the materials to get started, because food is a human right. Trans people are systematically denied not only just our basic human rights, but we're denied by cis-focused organizations the opportunity to build a platform and build systems to take a hold of our rights for ourselves, because we don't have any power. You know, the power of our movement has been taken away from us and corporatized and profitized into, you know, six-figure, $250,000 salaries for CEOs who run organizations that get called out by the community every other year for racism and transphobia. or for firing and pushing out Black trans women that dare to speak up about their rights and their ability to self-determine in the workplace. And, you know, this is why we have to have a resource shift. This is why our community keeps dying, because the services that say that they're there to serve us aren't actually meant for us. And the services that are actually meant for us are so drastically underfunded that we can only serve a handful of the people that are in need. And, you know, saving 5 lives is great, but we want to save every damn person in our community, because we know trans women, especially Black and brown trans women, have all the solutions to all the problems in our community. The community knows how to solve its problems. We've been doing this for decades, centuries, millennia. There have always been trans people, and we've always had the solutions. But the issue is we need to be able to have the resources to make those solutions a reality. And if we can get resources into the hands of our community, I mean, watch our numbers climb. Watch our life expectancy climb. Watch our income median climb. Watch our housing rates climb. Watch everything get better once the most oppressed people are empowered to solve their own problems on their own terms.
What's shocking is that the average life expectancy of a Black trans woman is 35 years old.
Mm-hmm.
That is unacceptable. And we need action now.
Absolutely. And, you know, and another, I'm going to see your shocking number. I'm going to give folks another one. Between 1999 and 2019, in the city of Chicago, 20 years, there was a 20-year period when the murder of a trans woman in this city was not solved, barely even addressed by CPD. Now, fuck the police, you know, demilitarize, disarm, defund, disband the police, because they have never been a friend to our community. Stonewall was a riot against police brutality and police harassment, first and foremost. We can never forget that. So it is a disgrace when cops show up at Pride. But, you know, these systems that were put in place to at least pretend to care about us don't even do a very good job. 20 years between the murders of a trans woman being solved, until Brave Space Alliance went out there and put pressure on CPD and put pressure on the mayor's office and told folks that they were on notice, that they better start caring when people in our community get killed. And I think we've solved the last 2 murders. So, you know, we can't rely on the system. We can't rely on cops, but we have to make it known that just like Black trans lives matter, Black trans deaths matter too. You can't value life if you're going to completely devalue, dead name, and misgender somebody in death.
Thank you. Aisha and anybody else who wants to chime into this one, how do you see the movement for the trans justice intertwined with the movement to defund and even abolish the police?
Honestly, I'm just gonna go ahead and answer that based on the answer that Stephanie just gave, right? When the systems that have been created, overfunded, over-militarized, not held accountable, and kind of blatantly ignore the rights of the people who not only they're supposed to serve and protect, but who pay for them to exist, right? When that happens, and we see that, like both Stephanie and Elise said, it's not an accident. It's not the system not working. It's actually the system working in a way that we're not supposed to think it was designed to do so, right? So there can be no true liberation for Black trans women with the way that the policing system looks right now. It's not an option. And I think that it's important to think about what these terms that people are becoming more and more comfortable saying actually mean, right? Like, I know that there have been a lot of conversations about what does it mean to defund, but it seems like everyone knew what defund meant when it was about Planned Parenthood. People have questions about what it means to abolish, but everyone seems to understand what abolition means when we learn in high school about slavery. So I just want folks to remember that this language is not new. It's not a trend. It's not something that just popped up. It's something that people have been working on for decades, if not centuries, honestly. So to imagine a world or envision a world or manifest and create a world where we're not seeing these harms done, we're not seeing the violence and harm that is perpetuated by the systems that exist right now, it's not by just reforming those systems. We've tried it, we've done it. Reformation has been attempted. We've had reports and independent investigations and different new sources of funding and different agencies from the federal level looking at Chicago. You know what I mean? It's like every time we get to a boiling point, there's just a new addendum added to the existing system, as though people don't realize that the system itself is what is the problem. So there is really there's no separation of those two things. They go hand in hand. I think that there is an important conversation that folks really need to be ready to engage in, that both Stephanie and Elise have brought up, and that's around actual equity and what it means and how that looks. What that looks like is taking the nearly $1.8 billion that the CPD is being given, and think about how many lives that could save, how many murders it can prevent by not funding a department that has done unquantifiable harm and damage, not only through murder, but also just the complete decimation of neighborhoods on purpose, right? The decimation of communities purposefully, right? So when we think about what defunding and abolition looks like, it means taking that money, taking those resources, taking those tables that people don't want to invite Black trans women to, and actually just giving them over. There's no way for us outside of communities that are experiencing all of this harm to actually answer things for people. And like both Stephanie and Elise said, there's no way to exempt yourself from shifting your own power if you're not in this community. So that goes for any other group that experiences oppression as well, right? So there's no way for us to, actually see true liberation if we're not willing ourselves to, and I don't even thinking of it as handing over, right? It's not handing over, it's literally just the recognition of humanity and understanding that the things that everyone is owed by being born is insured.
Thank you for that. Next, we're going to kind of transition to another system that is really oppressive, the church and religious system. So Bryan, this is for you. And Kim, if you want to chime in, thanks to your Wikipedia page, I learned that you studied this. So if you want to chime into this. But something that I learned while researching and preparing for this was that research by the Movement Advancement Project said that only 8% of trans youth say that their houses of worship are accepting. So I guess Bryan, as a trans person whose dream is to work in this field, what are you doing to challenge and push that 92% of stuff that is rejecting? How do you navigate this knowing the history of oppression plus you want to be that positive force?
Sure. I think the important thing that I want to start off with is the Jesus movement. Christianity is not anti-trans people. That is theology, that is toxic theology that has been layered onto a movement that is about recognizing the value of all human beings. Jesus, the stories in the Bible that we know about him is that he sat and ate and learned and talked with sex workers and women and the people at the margins of society. So the message that he would have taught is love and value Black trans women because they are at the margins of society, the society we're in today. So I think I see it as my goal as a trans person who is deeply religious to take back the church from those layers of toxic theology that have been built upon it. And I think it's really important to do that because there are so many trans kids who are born into families that are steeped in this toxic theology, and we need to teach the families of trans people how to love their kids when the communities around them are telling them that it's against religion and it's a sin, because it is not. To be clear, being trans, being gay is not a sin, and we should not treat it as such. That is a political movement that has been put on top of Christianity. And I also recognize that the system, the church as an institution, is deeply broken and has done a lot of harm to trans people and other communities. And there's a lot of work that we need to do to unlearn and to repent for the harm that we have done to people.
Kim, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's been a little while since I did my field work. I and have no idea where that Wikipedia page came from, but there it is. But you know, I feel like with religion, and whether it's Christianity, Judaism, or Islam, whatever it would be. I mean, I grew up with a mother who was raised Shinto, so I don't know. But I will say that that religion for me, if it's a place that you want to be and it's a place you want to go into, you find the people who welcome you. I feel like trying to butt up against a system's, whether it's a single church or an overall, religion that is struggling, you have to really watch for what kind of abuse happens. There's abuse that happens within religion that profoundly impacts folks, and we have to make certain that when they come to our door and they say, this is the experience I had in this church or in this, mosque or temple or wherever that house of worship might be, that we listen to them, that we pay attention, that we, hold those systems as accountable as we'd hold any other system. They don't get exempt, right? They're not exempt because they're a religion, which I can't imagine anybody on this call would even bat an eye at. But then there are places that are really welcoming and really good and really, places where you can thrive within religion, and talk to people about, a lot of folks who've had to go through that process of letting go religious past that they've had in order to move forward in a religion that really welcomes them. And you can find those pockets, you can find those people, and and to gravitate toward those places that will accept. And that's what we have to really help people to see, is that, go to the places that, surround yourself with good people, constantly fighting up and butting up against the system can be exhausting and can be really harmful to your to your full self. So, yeah.
Thank you. Ted, this question came in, it was interesting, 3 different times specifically for you from different people. It seems that there are a lot of longtime advocates and people who have been involved in the LGBTQ community for a while. And folks are curious about what can they do now and going forward that is different from what they've done in the past? What is that, right? Showing up and taking it and the financial stuff, but within the organization or the movement, what are things that they can do?
So one of the things we're doing, we've been trying to focus on more the last couple of years at the Night Ministry, is listening to the experiences of young people, especially, their good and their bad experiences, and figuring out kind of how we can improve our services and what we're doing better. So I think that's been a huge thing for us, is engaging the lived experience of young people and youth voice in our programming. But also I think there from an advocacy perspective, the things that I work on, there's topics that are always going to get a lot of press attention. So for example, this week, we're expecting a really harmful rule to come out of HUD, a proposed rule around shelter access for trans individuals. And that's going to get a lot of press. I really recommend people to go to a website called housingSavesLives.org. It's a movement being led by True Colors United to kind of push back against that proposed rule that we've been expecting for about a year. But there's smaller things that I don't think get enough coverage. So for example, Health and Human Services is a funder that provides funding specifically for runaway and homeless youth programs. They fund shelter services for minors, street outreach programs for homeless youth, and transitional living programs for homeless youth. And the administration, the current administration, has removed all LGBT language from those funding proposals. And so what that means is that providers who are granted money under that no longer have to learn about inclusion of LGBTQ youth. They don't have to show that their policies are competent or accepting. Our training and technical assistance provider across the country does not have to provide those trainings. And that kind of information exchange is completely removed from the national conferences that they sponsor. So there's smaller things like that too that that folks can be aware of if they network with organizations and talk to organizations.
Awesome. As somebody who works in government, I am pro people voting, obviously, like please vote all the time. But please also lobby every layer of government all the fucking time. Like your voice truly matters. So like figure out what it is.
Yeah, it's really like some of the small things, right? Like zoning process, for example, the last 2 zoning processes we had to go through, we had to fight to make sure that the zoning board didn't gender our programs. So you mentioned that the crib is moving in a couple weeks to Bucktown, and the zoning board wanted us to put walls up separating young people by gender, which for our program makes no sense, right? So so yeah, there's levels that people don't even think about at all levels of government.
Absolutely. There was a movement a few years ago about like IP freely or something like that, because there's some archaic code in the stuff. So kind of sticking to still kind of policy and things like that. Where did my question go? Aisha, this one is for you. So after the Trump administration this month repealed the ACA's healthcare protections for trans people and gender nonconforming people, should we look to state and local legislation as a potential stopgap? Is there anything being done in Chicago or in Illinois specifically that would protect trans people in need of medical care?
Yes, look to every level to speak against this kind of behavior. So there are protections in place in the state of Illinois. So the concerns that we have federally are, I won't even say that they're less of a concern here, but I will say that there are protections in place. I think that there will be a little more clarity about that coming down pretty soon. So just definitely keep an ear out for that. But thinking about who can provide a buffer between really terrible administrations and our everyday life. Honestly, I agree with your idea of like talking to every level of government. I mean, talk to your alder person, talk to anyone in the city's administration that you can, county level, state level, all of those levels matter. And they are important and they all influence different areas of our lives. So the frustrating thing is that we're constantly going to have to keep our eyes open and ears open about what's happening from this federal administration, all the terrible rules that are coming down, including the HUD rule that was just mentioned. But we also have to not think that because we're in a state that typically leans blue that we have all of the things in place. And just to kind of echo what was said earlier, I can't remember who said it, but the idea that all of these systems are connected, right? So having something in place that will help protect healthcare and limit the ability of anyone in the medical industries who discriminate against someone based on their gender identity. It's all well and fine to say that once you get into the clinic, the person behind the desk can't discriminate against you. But if we're not doing anything to make sure that people are safe getting to and from the clinic, how does that help? If we're not making sure that people are able to make the appointment that they need to, if we're not limiting access to healthcare, especially telehealth services, based on whether a pandemic is happening or not. If we're not assuming that just providing telehealth services is enough, because some people don't have smartphones or laptops that they can use. If we're not limiting access to medication based on having a permanent address, if we're not limiting access to those medications based on like a monthly limit and allowing 90-day refills, like all of these different things are intertwined and they all affect our community in every way that you can imagine. So I will say, yes, there are some buffers in that one area, but the real concern is making sure that there is more work being done on all fronts to help head off all of the terrible federal administration changes.
Absolutely. Brian?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this that just non-discrimination legislation is not going to be enough to fix the healthcare system. I am an engineer with private insurance, and I originally had a surgery date of December 1st, 2017, and I still have not had that surgery yet because it has been tied up in insurance for over 3 years. So we really need to fix this broken healthcare system instead of trying to prop it up with legislation. I mean, I'm not saying that it's a bad thing for us to be working on this. We absolutely should be, but there's so much more expansive work that needs to be done.
Exactly. Like, I couldn't agree with you more. It feels sometimes like going down all of these paths, especially with impact litigation, like a lot of larger orgs try to do, it's us waiting, holding our breaths for a 5-year litigation process, hoping that you're granted cert at the Supreme Court, hoping that the Supreme Court makes the right decision. And then even after the decision is made, waiting for it to be implemented properly, right? And the other problem with that is that even when we do get policies or regulations that seem to be on the right side of things, there's always the fine print. There's always the question of how does it actually look in practice, right? And that's why, like Stephanie and Elise have said, I'm going to keep coming back to the two of them. You can't just act like this is a one moment situation. You can't just say that you're going to write people into a grant. You can't just use folks' identities to try to make money. You have to actually engage with community. And that's why grassroots organizations are so important and imperative, right? We don't know how to fix these issues or not even fix the systems. We don't know how to fix the issues and create new systems if we're not in conversation with and understanding and hearing about the things that are actually a problem. I can say all day what's hurting me, what's harming me, what's hard for me, what roadblocks I'm facing, but that does not mean that it's automatically going to line up with what everyone else needs. And so if we're not actually figuring out how to write the policy, how to have it implemented, how to make sure that in 2, 4, 6 years when it needs to be rewritten or even just taken out completely, right? We don't know when those things are happening if we're not actually engaging in community constantly.
Yeah, and then, I think it's really important, since we touched on non-discrimination laws, to talk about, what is a non-discrimination law in the first place? Like, what is its actual impact? And its actual impact is incredibly little. A non-discrimination law in effect says that if you are harmed based on discrimination that you can prove was based on your membership in a specific protected class, then you can file a lawsuit, which is almost impossible to win. This is why things like at-will employment are an issue. This is why things like RFRA laws and religious exemptions are an issue, because when you have non-discrimination laws, then even when you have good policy in place, how do you make use of that good policy? When you have non-discrimination laws in place, essentially what you're doing is you're adding one step further to the discrimination, actually making it harder to prove that you were discriminated against in the first place. And these things don't even touch on the discrimination that most people experience, which is the hardest to prove. For most non-discrimination laws talk about what happens when you're in the interview process, when you're already in the doctor's office, when you've already made it into the store, when you are inside of somewhere trying to, purchase a good or a service, trying to get a job, trying to get access to healthcare, trying to get access to housing. And they don't talk about or substantively address any of the discrimination that happens before initial point of contact. And if you don't address those kinds of discrimination, then you're going to see, you're not going to see many non-discrimination cases in the first place because they're so difficult to prove, but you're also going to miss out on a lion's share of the discrimination that actually happens to multiply marginalized people that's so invisibilized that we often can't even identify it as discrimination until way too late after the fact.
And it's a money suck out of the communities that need the money, because if there's anything that a cis white gay guy and many folks beyond that really love is to be able to fund a good anti-discrimination campaign, right? So it just sucks all the money out for like the mutual aid work that BSA does, you know, and all this really good work that actually does move, you know, our culture. So yeah, I just think it's one of those things that people go to black tie events for, and you're just like, stop it now.
Yeah. And you know, I think Kim made a really important point that, you know, speaking of cis white gay men, you know, when we look at the Supreme Court decision about employment, who filed those lawsuits?
Yep.
You know, a cis passing white trans woman who had a perfect case, and then a cisgender white gay man who had a perfect case. The people who these, you know, who policy like that and who Supreme Court decisions like this one help are the people with the most privilege within marginalized communities. People who really, really need good public policy will never benefit from non-discrimination ordinances. And we've been talking about this, you know, since Kimberly Crenshaw and before. You know, when so many people talk about intersectionality, but so few people have actually read the intersectionality article. And in it, she's talking about how it's so difficult. You know, Crenshaw talks about how difficult it is to prove a discrimination claim when you are multiply marginalized, because it's impossible to prove, in her case, whether she was discriminated against because she was a woman or because she was Black, when in reality she was being discriminated against in multiple ways because she was a Black woman. And so trans women of color, Black and brown trans women, will, you know, our lawsuits, even white trans women like me, our lawsuits will never see the light of day unless we're gender conforming, independently wealthy, have connections to fund our lawsuits, you know, have a perfect case where somebody came up to our face and said, "You're trans, you're fired." You know, it's almost absurd how much time and energy we waste on making useless policy when the only real good policy is resource redistribution. The courts won't save us and the legislators won't save us. And as unfortunately we're seeing in Chicago right now, people in positions of power who share our identities won't necessarily save us either.
So the hard part, well, before, I'm sorry, Elise, I don't mean to cut you off. Did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I was just saying that I agree with what Stephanie said, and it goes to show the inequity within the LGBTQ community, especially the Supreme Court ruling, and how, you know, everyone is celebrating this win. However, this is benefiting people who already have the job, right? But what about Black trans women who can't even get the damn job? So it doesn't really benefit Black trans women like me if we can't even get a damn job in the first place.
Exactly. And also, just to kind of add a footnote to what Stephanie is saying, definitely check out the article Mapping the Margins by Kimberly Crenshaw. And if you are a legal nerd, check out the case DeGraff and Reed, which is one of the ones that she cited, where there were Black women with factory jobs who were being discriminated against. But because Black men and white women said that they didn't experience discrimination, the courts were like, well, it can't actually exist. Because what's happening to you specifically doesn't fall under sexism, doesn't fall under racism, and so we can't actually address it, right? So it's these, like we've been saying this whole time, it's this conversation around multiple jeopardy, around intersectionality, around what it actually means. And I know that there are a ton of people who work in the area of impact litigation, where a lot of times it is extremely strategic to try to find that perfect plaintiff, right? But there is a reason why I'm not working in impact litigation, because it is not going to benefit our community if we're only looking for perfection, if we're looking for that perfect plaintiff, if the only quote unquote strike against you, right, is your identity that you're being discriminated against based on, right? Like, it should not be a question whether we will take those cases as well as cases of people who have been discriminated against, who have faced harm, who've been experiencing violence based on whatever identities that we're trying to protect. It doesn't help if we're turning those people away when we find out that they may have a history, they may have had convictions, they may do sex work, they may, all of these different things. There should never be a question of whether we're going to go to the mat for all of these folks who are experiencing this harm. There's nothing that anyone can do that will justify them being murdered because they are Black and trans and a woman, right? Like there's nothing that, and you could tell me, that would make me say someone deserves to be murdered for their identity. So using that as a way to quote unquote weed out potential plaintiffs really does our entire movement a disservice, because, you know, as much as everyone likes to put up Marsha P. Johnson's picture when June rolls around, right? How many of us are actually filing cases for the people who are in Marsha's shoes today? Mm-hmm. How many of these organizations are hiring the Marshas today? How many of these organizations are not trying to find that person and bring her into the room so that we can add that extra zero to our grant application, right? How many people are making sure that we give that money over to that community?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of like the hiring work, some of the work that Elise that you do is around the like hire trans now. So the question that came in is, what additional work do you see the Chicago Therapy Collective and Hire Trans Now doing in the next 5 years, and where do you see yourself within this movement?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jessie. Well, I just want to start off by saying Chicago Therapy Collective is a grassroots organization that is working towards liberating Black and brown trans people in Andersonville and beyond, the whole Chicagoland area. And we have an initiative called Hire Trans Now, which employers can sign on, and it is a commitment to actively recruit transgender job applicants, and you can actually sign on. I'm going to send you all the link where you can actually sign on and get other employers that you know that would be interested in signing on to sign on. So I'll add that into the chat. And 5 years from now, well, we have a model. We have aldermen that we work with, as Andre has signed on, which we're so excited about. So we work with aldermen for that policy lens. We work with chambers. We're working with the Andersonville Chamber of Commerce for that aspect. We also work with community leaders, such as nonprofit organizations, and that's one aspect. And we also work with community members as well, which are our Hire Trans Now representatives, who are on the ground doing the work and signing on organizations. So 5 years from now, we definitely see ourselves having a model that other neighborhoods can use. So we can just make that, we plan to make, you know, trans inclusive Chicago campaign citywide. So that's definitely where we see ourselves in 5 years, as just Hire Trans Now initiative and our Trans Inclusive Chicago campaign just growing citywide. And we plan to hand off that model to different neighborhoods within Chicago, from Bronzeville on the south side to Rogers Park up on the north side. And with the goal of just trans people being liberated financially, economically, mental health wise, and, you know, because economic justice is what leads to trans people having everything else, right? So that's how we're approaching this, through economic justice for transgender people, and having that model across Chicago for all neighborhoods, definitely in 5 years.
Thank you. So I know that we're at 3 o'clock, so we will close up soon and wrap up soon and let everybody have an opportunity to pitch whatever you want or say whatever you want at the closing as a thank you for being on this panel. To kind of second what Elise was saying, my challenge to folks, like anybody who is in a hiring position, right? Like when you are actively going out and posting on Hire Trans Now, like don't expect that in 1 month somebody is going to be able to get their resume and cover letter and be able to drop everything to like come in for interviews. So like be mindful and stuff like that, because there's right, as a lot of the panelists have talked about, there's many more barriers. And so getting time off for work is not always the easiest thing. And they may not know to look at certain sites for jobs. So like, be mindful in that. So we're gonna.
And can I add something onto that real quick?
Absolutely.
So one of the things that Brave Space Alliance does in our own employment practices is we hire direct from community. And when you are going to hire trans people, it is so important that you're not just hiring trans people because you want to hire a trans person, but you're actually committed to that trans person's professional development. One of the biggest ways that trans people are marginalized in employment is we are not given the skills or the tools to exist in a quote unquote professional workplace, because professionalism is this like racist and transphobic concept that's spun around whiteness and cisnormativity. So when you are hiring a trans person, when you want a trans person to come to your nonprofit, to come to your business, to do whatever you want to pay them to do, you have to remember that they are going to bring their full selves to that job, or they're not going to stick around that long. You know, if you're not creating an environment where trans people are going to feel welcome and freed and seen as themselves and given opportunities to grow and not just exist as tokens, then you're not actually hiring a trans person, you're hiring a diversity poster. And that diversity poster is not going to stick around very long.
Mm-hmm. And it's also important that your organization hires trainers that are actually Black and trans to actually do the trainings. For Chicago Therapy Collective, we also have a Get Trained initiative, and organizations, it doesn't matter if you're a tiny mental health organization or a huge corporation, we can tailor trainings to your organization, and we could have someone come in and actually ensure that your policies within your organization are trans affirming. And we have a portion of Hire Trans Now as well, which is a checklist to ensure that your organization is meeting requirements within an interview aspect, interview, as well as a interview and recruitment type of categories and requirements that are just to ensure that trans people feel safe and affirmed and are actually, like Stephanie said, trained and mentored and sponsored to just thrive in an organization.
Awesome. Thank you for that. So again, thank you everybody for being here. We're going to do a round robin to let all of the panelists say anything that they want for closing. This is your space. This is a way to say thank you for giving us an hour of your time and brain and just your awesome human person, so you can talk about whatever you want. And Ted, we're going to start with you because I know that you have another event. So sorry that we went a little late. Apologies.
No worries. So thanks so much for including us in the conversation. I think for many of you who are familiar with the work of the Crib and the young people we serve there, I just want to invite you to follow our social media, because in the coming weeks, we'll be moving that program down to a space in Bucktown that's been specially designed for the program and the young people who stay there. Currently, we're operating 24/7 at the Crib, and so it's going to complicate the move a little bit, but we're really excited about the opportunity that the new space is going to provide us to provide deeper services for young people and partner better with the community and have more space for the community to come in and provide services with us. So that'll be our move, we're hoping, in 2 weeks, but we'll see. And so we're gonna have video tours and stuff like that, since we won't be able to have a lot of visitors in the space right now.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you for being here. Stephanie?
Thanks. Yes, so if you want to learn more about Brave Space Alliance, if you want to learn more about our mission and vision and our programs, you can go to our website, bravespacealliance.org. And the thing that I'm actually going to pitch you is a great way to redistribute some of the resources that you might have for yourself. So Brave Space Alliance, we're a newer organization, but we're growing really, really fast. And we're trying to build a permanent home for our organization in Hyde Park, as well as make our crisis pantry, which has served over 18,000 people since the beginning of COVID-19. And that accelerated at the beginning of the George Floyd rebellions, when we expanded our services to jail support protesters and pop-up serving Black and brown folks in food deserts. You can go and support our building campaign. We're trying to raise $800,000 to cover our rent for the next several years, our bills, our staff's salary, all of our construction and renovation costs, and to make our food pantry permanent, you can go to bit.ly/BSA_building. And that will, you know, every dollar that you give, it goes towards Brave Space Alliance making a permanent home for ourselves in Hyde Park on the south side. We're planning to be representing and serving our community for years to come.
Thank you for that. Kim?
I'm going to back it up to a little bit of what we were talking about earlier. Another thing I want to talk about in terms of hiring and having space is we don't often talk about mental health when it comes to the work that we do. And I want to make certain that people understand that during these times, especially as you're seeing much more activism and a lot more stuff in social media and work, that you give people in your workspace most profoundly affected by these newscasts and all this information time off, or, you know, paid time off, and, you know, time to process, and maybe work redistribution and rethinking, you know, maybe somebody might need to leave part of the, you know, part of the day. Yeah, giving people that kind of space.
Thank you. Brian?
One thing that a final point that I wanted to address is we've talked a lot about the work that other cis communities need to do to support Black trans women. I also want to just reiterate that there are different levels of privilege even within the trans community, and people who are white, straight trans men like me, we have to do our part. And I think it takes the work of a lot of different people doing what they can to talk to people within their own spheres, because there's transphobia even within the LGBT community, and there are people that are comfortable with me who are not members of the community, and it takes a lot of work from all of us to take the burden off of the people who are most at risk in the community. And then a thing I would like to pitch is Kim mentioned that there are plenty of affirming churches. My own church, All Saints Chicago in Ravenswood, is openly very affirming to trans people and anyone in the LGBT community. And right now, All Saints is working on a project. It's called the Greenlining Campaign, to counteract the racist redline policies of the past decades. We are raising $200,000 to build a first model home in a program that will hopefully include 1,000 homes to increase Black home ownership in North Lawndale. And we're also raising $15,000 to train a community organizer from North Lawndale, invest in her development so that she can become a leader in her own community. And I'm gonna post a link in the chat, and I hope you all look at it and consider donating, because it's like we talked about, redistributing wealth is one of the best ways that we can help support communities.
Thank you for that. Aisha?
So I guess the last couple of things that I would just pitch are that if you need any assistance or connection to resources and you're a person living with or vulnerable to HIV, visit AFC's website at aidschicago.org. And then also at Affinity Community Services, we just hired our new executive director, Mackenzie Mack. And they have been definitely taking the lead for us to have a really robust fundraiser happening right now, and we are nearly at our $50,000 goal. That $50,000, yes, that $50,000 will be used to ensure that Affinity is around for 25 more years, right? So we've been around, we want to stay around, we want to continue to work with and for community. I believe that we are over 45,000 right now. I think the last time I looked, it was around 45,500. So if you can help us get to that 50K goal, we will appreciate it. I think one of the things we've been saying once we passed 25 was for folks to just encourage people to double down on those donations if you have it to spare. And just remember that when we're talking about all of these things, it is absolutely a marathon, not a sprint. We are not here just for this one moment. These are not communities that have just popped up, even if you're just now learning the language. These are not movements that are just popping up, even if it's new language to use. So remember that it does more harm for you to try to jump in and then jump back out when it's not exciting for you anymore. So purposefully, intentionally, and constantly invest in these communities directly. It will do a lot more good to give directly to the organizations that are in and serve the community than to try to quote unquote fix the organizations that have shut their doors to us before.
Thank you for that. And we will finish with Elise.
Yes. Oh, I just want to say thank you, Jessie, for having me, and thank you everyone for coming. And a few takeaways I want everyone to know is that, you know, trans rights are more than just bathrooms. They're more than just, they're more than just, as much as IDs are so important as well. I'm so glad we have those rights to be able to correct our IDs. We're more than just those things, and we really, really, really need economic justice. And everyone needs to do their part to ensure that the trans community has economic justice. And if you want more information about Chicago Therapy Collective and our Trans Inclusive Chicago campaign, Hire Trans Now, please visit transinclusivechicago.org/hire. And like Aisha said, I want this conversation to keep going. And one way we can do that is through a organization I just joined called the Office Hours Collective. We're just a group of people who are passionate about diversity and inclusion and equity. And you can just ask us questions and we'll answer those questions. And we just, you know, we just want to keep this conversation going and not to just fizzle away or fizzle out, because, you know, trans people aren't going anywhere anytime soon. So we need our rights and we need them now. So I'll definitely add a link to that as well. And thank you all.
Wonderful. Again, my name is Jessie Peters. I'm a member of 40th United. We are a IPO here in the 40th Ward. We're pretty new. I think we're less than a year old. I probably should know that, but we host these conversations and we try to not just host the things that are kind of in topic, but I am somebody who like works in government during the day, and my goal in life is to make sure that everybody can live like the highest quality life that they want, however they define that self. For themselves. And so thank you everybody for being here today and spending part of your Sunday with us. I'm sure that there are links in the chat about how to get involved with 40th United. And yeah, thank you everybody. Thanks for being here. Have a great Sunday.